Have you ever realized the people you gave everything to never really wanted you around? I spent years helping, paying, sacrificing, and suddenly, one day, I wasn't invited to the one moment that mattered most. Not forgotten, not overlooked, excluded. And yet, they still expected me to fund their lives. That's when I realized something terrifying. Being useful isn't the same as being loved. The night everything changed did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, slipping into my life the way truths often do, without permission, without mercy. The house was still, the kind of stillness that makes you notice the smallest things, the blinking clock on the microwave, the hum of the refrigerator, the echo of my own breathing. That was the night I found out I had been left out. Not forgotten, not overlooked, left out. The wedding had already happened by the time the truth reached me. Papers signed, smiles exchanged, a new life officially begun without me standing anywhere near it. The realization did not hit all at once. It spread slowly, like cold through the bones, settling deeper with every passing minute. I had spent years believing proximity meant importance, that being needed meant being loved. I had confused generosity with belonging and sacrifice with security. I thought showing up financially, emotionally, consistently meant I would always have a place. I was wrong. The signs had been there long before that night. The subtle distancing, the shortened updates, the way my role quietly shifted from family to resource. I had ignored it all because acknowledging it would have meant admitting that love, in their eyes, had conditions. Their life was built on foundations I helped pour. The apartment, the furniture, the groceries stocked without being asked, the emergency expenses that never waited for the right time. I told myself I was helping them stand on their own, but somewhere along the way, they stopped standing and started leaning hard. The blue dress in my closet still carried its tags. I had bought it imagining a moment that never came, a moment I was never meant to be part of. Standing there, alone, I understood something that hurt more than exclusion itself. I had prepared for a future that didn't include me. A week passed, heavy and slow. Time moved forward, but my place in their lives had clearly moved backward. Then the expectation returned, silent but confident. Support was assumed, not requested. The system I had created was supposed to keep running, regardless of how invisible I had become. That was when the fog lifted. I finally saw the truth without emotion clouding it. I was valuable only as long as I was useful. Once my presence was no longer required, my role was reduced to financial convenience. I was not family in moments of joy, only in moments of need. That realization didn't break me. It freed me. I sat alone with my bank statements spread out in front of me, numbers telling a story I had avoided reading. Thousands spent not as gifts, but as silent agreements I never signed. Each transaction marked a time I chose peace over boundaries, help over honesty. And then I stopped. No announcements, no explanations, just action. I reclaimed what was mine, my money, my control, my future. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. For the first time in years, I felt something unexpected. Relief. But relief does not go unnoticed by people who depend on your exhaustion. That afternoon, as I pulled into my driveway, something felt wrong before I fully understood why. Cars I didn't expect were parked where they didn't belong. Movement flickered behind windows that should have been still. My home, my safe place, felt altered, occupied. I stayed in the car, heart pounding, hands gripping the steering wheel. Because in that moment, I realized something dangerous. When you stop being useful, you become disposable. When you stop giving, you become a problem. And when you take your power back, you become a threat. Whatever waited for me inside that house was no longer about money. It was about control. The moment I stopped sending money, the quiet changed its shape. At first, it felt peaceful, almost unfamiliar. Then it became heavy, crowded with intention. Silence, I learned, is only respected when it doesn't disrupt anyone else's comfort. The first reactions came indirectly: missed calls, voicemails I didn't listen to, notifications that stacked on my screen like unpaid emotional debts. I recognized the pattern immediately. Concern always comes before pressure, pressure always comes before blame. I didn't respond. That refusal unsettled them more than anger ever could. I had spent years being predictable, reliable, available, financially present. My absence forced them to face something they hadn't prepared for: consequences. The emotional shift was almost visible. The narrative around me changed without my participation. I could feel it forming, carefully rewritten memories where my help was minimized and my boundaries were framed as betrayal. The same generosity that once defined me was now being recast as control. Support became interference, sacrifice became manipulation. I watched it happen from a distance, stunned by how quickly gratitude turned into resentment once expectations were interrupted. What surprised me most was how personal it became. They didn't ask what had changed. They assumed it was temporary, that I would come back once the discomfort became inconvenient enough. They underestimated the clarity that comes when you finally see yourself clearly. I had mistaken endurance for strength. In reality, endurance had only taught them how much I could absorb without complaint. The moment I stopped absorbing, they felt exposed. The pressure intensified. Messages became longer. Guilt became creative. My past sacrifices were repackaged as obligations I was now accused of abandoning. The story they told themselves required a villain, and I fit the role perfectly. I began to understand something deeply unsettling. They didn't miss me, they missed access. The house I lived in started to feel different, less like shelter, more like territory. I checked doors twice. I paid closer attention to sounds. When trust erodes, awareness replaces it. One afternoon, I noticed documents missing from where I always kept them. Not gone completely, just disturbed, touched, moved. It was subtle but deliberate, the kind of detail only someone desperate would overlook. That was when I realized the emotional pressure was only the first phase. Financial dependence doesn't disappear quietly. It fights back. It reshapes itself into entitlement, then into justification. When people believe something belongs to them, they stop asking. They start taking. I started protecting myself in ways I never had before. Passwords changed, accounts monitored, records copied and stored elsewhere, not out of paranoia, but preparation. Because something had shifted fundamentally. I was no longer the safety net. I was the obstacle. And obstacles are not negotiated with. They are removed. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the houses across the street, my phone lit up again. The frequency alone told me everything I needed to know. The desperation was escalating. The patience was gone. I didn't feel fear. I felt resolve. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was anticipating. And anticipation is power. As I locked the door that night, I understood the truth they were only beginning to grasp. I had stopped being predictable, and unpredictable people are dangerous, especially to those who once controlled the narrative. The morning light felt sharp against my eyes, slicing through the calm I had been building. For weeks, the silence had been mine, a quiet assertion of power. But that calm was fragile. The subtle manipulations had escalated into open attempts to reclaim what they had assumed was theirs. They weren't asking anymore. They were asserting, pushing, testing limits I had only just begun to enforce. I realized something terrifying. My absence had become their strategy. Every call I ignored, every message I refused to respond to, only seemed to fuel their determination. They had convinced themselves that persistence would break me, that loyalty could be demanded rather than earned. And for the first time, I understood how much people take when they believe something belongs to them. I began to watch them, not out of obsession, but necessity. The way their lives had grown comfortable, funded by me, became painfully obvious. Each luxury, each convenience, each small indulgence reminded me of all the times I had put their needs above my own. I remembered the late nights paying bills for apartments I had never lived in, the groceries stocked for kitchens I would rarely enter, the emergency expenses I had covered silently. The realization wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. My generosity had been treated as entitlement. The confrontation didn't come in words. It came in action. Their assumption that I would always accommodate, always forgive, always facilitate was shattered the first time they tried to enter my space without notice. Documents I relied on for security and control had been moved. My personal records had been rifled through. It was subtle, but deliberate. I didn't need proof. They wanted to be caught. Desperation leaves traces. I stopped thinking of them as family. I started thinking of them as intruders in a house I had made safe, in a life I had worked to protect. The shift was absolute. I was no longer their safety net. I was their obstacle, and obstacles provoke confrontation. I reached a point where remaining passive was more dangerous than asserting control, so I documented everything. Transactions, messages, visits, subtle manipulations. Each record was a shield, each timestamp a weapon. I began to feel a strange satisfaction watching patterns emerge, the way strategy reveals itself when studied carefully. I had learned something they would never understand. Power doesn't reside in demand, it resides in boundaries. That evening, the inevitable happened. They tried again. This time less cautiously. Someone appeared in my driveway, pacing. I watched from the window as a car idled too long, someone inside, impatient, assuming entitlement. My heart thudded, not with fear, but anticipation, the anticipation of the confrontation I had been preparing for. I didn't call out, I didn't react, I waited. They assumed dominance. They assumed I would be intimidated. But the truth had shifted. The balance of control was no longer theirs. And when they realized it, panic would replace their confidence. I had waited for months to be invisible, to be silent, to let my absence speak louder than any argument could. Now they would discover something far more unsettling, that my return to attention was deliberate, calculated. I was no longer the person who could be pushed aside. And when they finally crossed the line, I would be ready. That night, as I prepared for bed, a sound shattered the quiet, a deliberate knock on the door, slow, methodical, testing me. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. I had anticipated this, I had expected it, but the knowledge that someone believed they could intimidate me, someone who had counted on my predictability, was intoxicating. I realized in that moment that everything was about to change, not just for them, but for me. Because once control is taken seriously, it cannot be surrendered quietly. The knock at the door wasn't polite, it wasn't hesitant. It carried the weight of expectation, entitlement, and the audacity of people who believed the world owed me my obedience. I didn't move immediately. I stayed by the window, watching shadows shift, listening to the hum of a car engine idling too long, and feeling the thrill of anticipation that only comes when you know the balance of power has changed. For years, I had lived in the margins of my own life. Every act of generosity, every financial sacrifice, every silent support I gave had kept them comfortable while erasing me. I had been invisible, taken for granted, and expected to endure without question. But that era was over. That night, silence was my weapon, observation my strategy, boundaries my armor. The first wave of confrontation came in small, calculated steps, messages demanding explanations, subtle manipulations framed as concern, guilt disguised as urgency. I responded to none. I documented everything, creating a meticulous record of every attempt to coerce me back into the pattern they had long relied on. And then they crossed the line. The driveway, the car, the knock. My house, my sanctuary, was no longer abstract in my mind. It was under siege. I didn't flinch. I didn't panic. I had anticipated this escalation, and I was ready. When they finally entered, it was not with words. It was with assumptions, with entitlement, with the belief that I would be intimidated. But I was not the woman they had known. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and now I would reclaim everything that had been quietly taken from me. I walked to the door deliberately, letting the shadows stretch across the floor behind me. When I opened it, I didn't speak. I simply let them see the calm resolve in my eyes, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you have done nothing wrong, that your power lies not in anger, but in control. Their faces flickered with recognition of something they hadn't expected: strength, independence, boundaries unbroken. I didn't need to raise my voice. The silence said it all. The dynamic that had once kept me in perpetual sacrifice was shattered in an instant. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere shifted irreversibly. They attempted subtle encroachments only to meet resistance. They tried guilt only to be met with unflinching clarity. They sought to reclaim influence only to find it gone. Every attempt reinforced the truth. I was no longer an accessory to their comfort. I was sovereign over my life. For the first time in years, I felt relief that wasn't fleeting. I felt joy that wasn't borrowed. I felt freedom that wasn't conditional. And in that space, I discovered something far more valuable than their approval. I discovered myself. The final act wasn't dramatic in the way they imagined. There were no shouting matches, no public scenes, no overt revenge. It was quiet, decisive, invisible to anyone who hadn't seen the pattern from the beginning. I had taken back my autonomy, my peace, and my control. The people who had once assumed entitlement had learned, finally, that I would no longer be invisible, no longer be predictable, and no longer be dispensable. I didn't just survive, I flourished. Every decision, every boundary, every step of self-preservation builds a life they could never touch. I had stopped being useful, and in that choice, I became untouchable. Because true power, I realized, is not in giving endlessly. It is in knowing when to stop. And I had stopped. I learned that generosity is a gift only when it is respected, not demanded. I learned that love cannot be measured in dollars. I learned that the most powerful thing I could ever do was say enough and mean it. And now they know. I am not theirs. I am mine.